This is one of the things that I find puzzling, for example, about Dawkins, because Dawkins formulated the idea of meme, which is, by the way, the same idea as archetype. It's exactly the same idea, except he just stopped. It's like, okay, there are memes, they're selected for. Okay, selected on what basis exactly? Does that mean there's a hierarchy of memes? Are the memes more likely are the memes that are conserved more likely to be, what would you say, viable organisms? And if they're viable organisms, are they microcosms?
This is really interesting in terms of the survivability, because there's a point, I've spoken to Richard Dawkins, well, a number of times, but twice on my podcast. And the second time, somebody pointed out to me that there might be a point of agreement between you two that has been overlooked, which is that, I don't know if you've ever come across the evolutionary argument against naturalism, or the argument from reason, the idea that if you're a materialist, you can't trust your reasonable faculties. So Alvin Plantinga formulated this very well, very, very geniusly, I think, in saying that if you believe that evolution by natural selection happens materially, what does natural selection select for? Survivability. So if you're a materialist, that means that the very rational faculty that you're using right now evolved not to be sensitive to truth, but to survivability.
Yes, that's right.
And if that's the case, well,
definitely.
Why do you believe in the truth of evolution? Well, because you've been rationally convinced of it. But the thing that you've just assented to, the belief itself has just undercut the process by which you came to that belief.
Look, there's a whole, the New England pragmatists figured this out in like 1880.
Yeah, now I think this is a fascinating, I think it really is just a...
It is.
It's exciting. It's novel.
That's for sure. That's for sure. It's actually a point where Darwin and Newton do not come together.
How do you mean?
Well, the Darwinian definition of true and the Newtonian definition of true are not the same thing.
Here's the thing. You had a conversation with Sam Harris. You've had a number, but one of them, I don't think it was a live event. I think it was before that. You're talking about truth.
Yeah,
and you're
very
trying
awkward second talk I had with him. I was extremely ill.
It was. Do you know? It was awkward to listen to because it felt very much like. And I remember at the time thinking, what is this Jordan Peterson talking about? Like truth is like Darwinian. Truth is about like survivability. What do you mean? Truth is truth.
True the way an arrow flies.
Yeah, right. And now I asked Richard Dawkins about the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah.
I said, well, how can you know that what you believe is true? And he said, because believing true things makes me more likely to survive.
Hey, watch where you go with that.
I didn't catch it at the time, but I thought to myself afterwards, it was one of my commenters on Patreon actually had mentioned this. He was listening to Richard, and I said, but sometimes it's at least possible that something that's false helps you to survive. The rustling in the bushes, believing that that's a lion every time or a tiger, even if it's not, that helps you to survive because that one time that it is, you're still going to run away. And it costs you nothing to run away when it's not a tiger. So believing it's a tiger, even when it's not, is going to help you to survive.
That's why we have a negativity bias.
Yeah. And Dawkins says, well, yeah, of course there are some circumstances where believing something false could be beneficial to survival. And I said, well, how do you know that 2 + 2 = 4 is not one of those? And it seemed as though he was just saying that believing that would not be advantageous to our survival, which might well be true. But if that's the case, then suddenly I'm listening to what you're saying about truth being more sort of Darwinian and related to survivability. And I think maybe you two would agree there. And then I think, well, why is it that when you sit down with Richard Dawkins, you find it difficult to have a conversation with each other? And
well, I think it's partly because we don't know each other very well.
That's
right. And so,
true.
And also, there are things he knows that I don't know, and there are things I know that he doesn't know. Now, I would say in my defense that what would you say? I'm more of aware of the things he knows that I don't know than he is of the things I know that he doesn't know, right? So, for example, as far as I can tell, Dawkins doesn't know anything about the Jungian tradition of literary interpretation. And that actually, if you're going to talk about religion, that's actually a fatal flaw, right? So, and, he's called me, for example, drunk on symbols. It's like, well, the imagination is a biological function. And it has a structure and a purpose. And it has its own logos, its own intelligible order. And if you're not aware of that order, that doesn't make me drunk on symbols. It just means you don't know what you're talking about.
Now, that frustration that you appeal to there, when you hear Richard Dawkins, I think Terry Eagleton said that listening to Dawkins on theology is like listening to somebody write a book about biology whose only knowledge of the subject is having once read the Great British Book of Birds. And okay, fair enough.
But that actually turns out to be a real problem. And it's a problem with regards even to the meme idea, because you don't have to extend Dawkins' work very far to understand that religious stories are memes.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a hierarchy of memes, and some of them are very functional.
But then here's the thing, like that frustration that you're sort of throwing in that direction, I think people throw towards you when you say, well, religion, you don't have to look very far to see that religion is a meme. Well, without further clarification, and of course there's going to be it, you can understand why to somebody first listening, that sounds almost atheistic, or religion is a meme. No,
right?
Religion is not a true historical account of, the history of the universe.
It's not a true historical account.
It's a meme. Now, when you say that the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, what does it mean historically that the Spirit of God brooded upon the primordial waters? Like, what does that mean historically? Well, no one knows what
that means
historically.
I don't think that at least most of Genesis or parts of Genesis are supposed to be. I mean, the Bible is a library, right? It's not a book, and that means that it's going to contain different genres.
That's for sure.
And so when I read,
and some of them are more historically accurate, and some of them tilt more towards that kind of elusive. I don't mean elusive I mean ALLUSIV.
Elusive, yeah, sure.
Right? That elusive and symbolic form that characterizes Genesis 1.
So because there are different genres here, it depends on what story we're talking about. And I think that what I often observe you doing is we might talk about Christianity, and if you aren't comfortable committing to a historical ideal, you'll start talking about the Spirit moving over the face of the waters, which is obviously a much more mythological ideal, and not quite equivocating them, but moving between them too quickly and not delineating them enough. So if I asked you, do you think that the Spirit moved across the face of the waters, and you said to me something like, I think it's still happening.
Right, that is what I would say.
I'd say, hey, fair enough. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
It always happens. It happened at the beginning of time, and it's always happening.
When somebody says, did the Exodus story happen? Did the Jews enslaved in Egypt break free of their slavery and move to the Promised Land across the desert for 40 years? Did that happen? You have also said, of the Exodus specifically, it's still happening.
Yes.
Now, to me, that's far more inappropriate than saying that the Spirit is still moving across the face of the waters, because I think what people mean there is, do you believe that these people in that time period actually did this in such a way that, for instance, might show up in an archaeological report?
Well, I think that's the simplest answer to that is probably.
Sure, and that's fine too. But
we don't know. To the degree that there's been archaeological investigations into the kinds of biblical narratives that you've described, the archaeological evidence tends to fall on the side of historical accuracy in relationship to the Bible, quite surprisingly often.
Clearly, you've spent more time in Exodus than probably any person I've ever met in person, right? Clearly, the story sort of captivates you, and you think it's really important and can teach us a lot, right?
Yeah,
of course.
It's infinitely deep story.
I think most people speaking to you already know that you think that, right? And so when they ask you a question, when they suddenly say to you, but do you think it really happened?
Well, what the hell does that mean?
You must know that what they mean is what I was talking about a second ago, which is that sort of...
What? Okay, so fine. So it's easy just to turn this around. It's like, okay, what exactly happened in your historical account when Moses encountered the burning bush?
I don't need to know exactly what happened. What I need to know is...
I'm not asking you specifically
I know.
Or attacking you for that.
What I need to know is that if I sort of went to the Egyptian desert at sort of the time that this story is alleged to have taken place in history, would I see a mass movement of Israelites from Egypt into the Promised Land? Would I see people with feet walking through the desert, leaving footprints?
Well, let's take it apart rationally. So,
but you also understand that when someone's asking that, and you even if you don't like the question, you must understand what someone's asking.
Oh yes, I understand many of the things that they're doing simultaneously.
Then you must also understand that when you then say it's still happening, people just go, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, well, I would say that's not my problem.
But it becomes a problem when you understand that someone's asking a quite banal historical question.
Yeah, but you don't get to do that.
But why not?
Because the stories that you're dealing with aren't banal.
I agree, but
so you can't reduce them to something banal, even if it's what would you call it? Even if it's reassuring. This actually happened. well, then what do you do with the burning bush?
So
this actually happened.
One comparison I would make is between this and talking about fiction more broadly.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you got it right earlier. I would say you noted that the stories in the biblical library leap across genres.
Yes.
Right. Well, we know this because sometimes they're poetry and sometimes they're song. Yeah, exactly. And so in any given story, there's going to be historical account plus mythological overlay.
Yeah.
And, you have to be a discriminating reader to kind of see what's different. And you don't just get to say, well, all the mythological symbolism is historical reality.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's not.
But here's the thing, for example. So like take a piece of trivial fiction like Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
Right? We say like, okay, did that happen? Now, I think that what you'd probably say is something like, well, I don't think the events literally occurred, but I think that they obviously get at something that's sort of perennially true about human nature.
Exactly.
But then suppose I said to you,
right.
but hold on,
they they existed as a pattern.
But there's a scene in Forrest Gump when, I think he meets the president. Is it JFK at the time? I think he goes and meets John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And so I said to you, well, is JFK the like that specific part of that story? Is it true that JFK was the president?
Right.
And you would probably just say, yeah.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say anything more complicated. And even though the subject as a whole of like, is Forrest Gump true? Is Hamlet true? That's a complicated question.
Very.
But specifically, when I say, but interestingly, there's this little point I want to make in this broader discussion. Do you think that JFK was actually the president? You would say yes.
Why do you think it matters to people? Like, I don't know. These are ancient accounts. Let's
maybe
say
that's
the
biggest
Exodus.
problem. Maybe that's the biggest problem that you have with the people who are asking these questions.
It is. It's
and
like,
hopefully,
what point are you trying to make here?
So
the point is, I know what the point usually is the people who are asking the question believe that true unerringly means objectively happened in history, like the things that we're seeing right now happen.
Yeah.
It's like, well, no,
so
that's not what those stories are like.
For me,
some of it is, but
for a Christian, when asking you that, it's probably because for them they have an understanding of Christianity that requires believing in that kind of truth. For me,
and the
reason why I hope that like me asking these questions will be less frustrating to you is because I have no desire for that. I don't care about that. I'm genuinely just interested in what you think.
Yeah,
and so
understood.
my desire to know whether you think Exodus historically happened goes no further than a point of interest about your beliefs.
Well, so there's elements of especially the setup to the Exodus story that strike me as very, very plausible historically.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the Jews before the Pharaoh of that time were under the guidance and protection of Joseph and the previous Pharaoh. And they regarded the Israelites as benefactors because Joseph had helped save the kingdom and his people were welcome. But that was forgotten. And so the new Pharaoh and the new Egyptians regard the appallingly successful Jews as destructive interlopers, and they make them slaves. It's like, well, can you believe that? It happens all the time.
Sure.
It's happening right now.
So it's
very
sounds to me
plausible.
that in this particular case, saying it's very plausible, it's like saying something like, well, yeah, it could have happened, I don't know.
Well, I don't know.
I
don't think anybody knows.
So when somebody asks, did the Exodus really happen? That word really, when they say, like, if I just said,
really is the crux.
If I said, did the Exodus happen? And I'd understand why you would then say, well, you've got to understand what kind of story this is. Fine.
Yes.
But then if somebody says, yeah, but did it really happen?
Well, which parts of it?
Even if they're not expressing it very well, like what they're getting at there is they're trying to emphasize the historicity. They're trying to say, yeah, but did it historically happen? Probably is what they mean by the word really there.
Right. But the thing is, it speaks of the problem is that Christians who ask that have a metaphysics that's not Christian.
Mm-hmm.